Hello, I'm Robert, and this is to help you if you're scared about these stories that supposedly Russia's going to invade Ukraine or whatever. And my, how the Western media are playing it up and making it seem so scary. So here's some of the things to bear in mind. First, Ukraine does not have nukes. Ukraine gave up all its nukes in 1994, gave them all back to Russia. And in return, Russia, UK, and USA all agreed not to attack or threaten Ukraine and gave it security assurances if it is attacked. So Ukraine does not have nukes, it's not part of NATO, it gave away its nukes. And that's the Budapest Memorandum 1994. And Putin has said many times Russia will not invade Ukraine. And with this background, remember in 1994 they promised not to do anything like this. And with this background, if they then cross over the border, if they do any kind of invasion, then this is going to be very, very bad for Russia's reputation in the Baltic states, which Russia wants to extend its influence and kind of rebuild the former USSR. But it's not going to do that by threatening and by actually invading Ukraine. That's going to backfire horribly on these ambitions of Russia. And Russia is not going to attack NATO. There's no way. That's you get people. I get people saying, "Oh, but Russia's going to." Putin is basically not a sane person, and Putin just wants a world war, and he thinks he'll be better off with the world war. Well, if you're thinking that way, then just bear in mind that this is the Putin's so-called palace. It's a big luxury palatial building that people supposedly say is for him to use as he likes, and he's got lots of friends amongst the big wealthy oligarchs in Russia. And how are these wealthy people going to benefit from nuclear bombs falling on Russia and radioactive ash falling on all their palaces? Even if you think they have absolutely no ethics, they have no interest in the common Russian people, and they'll have friends, they'll have people they like and people they work with in Russia. They're not just. But even if you imagine that they're just got no interest in anyone except themselves and their palaces, even then it's not sane for even the most ruthless people to want a nuclear war. And then you get people saying, "Oh, but Putin, maybe he's mad or something." Well, one, he is an autocrat, in the sense that he's not a normal democracy, but even an autocrat depends on it's impossible for one person to control a country. We don't have any magical devices that somehow could convert everyone to just be like robots and do whatever he wants. Even Kim Jong-un, none of the dictators are like that. They have lots of people around them who support them. And just as would happen with any country, then if he went mad, literally went mad, then the other people around him, they just wouldn't support him anymore, and he wouldn't last long at all. So you don't need to worry about Putin starting an absolutely illogical, pointless and stupid. He's not, he's sane, he's calculating. He's ruthless is not the same as being mad. So those are two things that hopefully will help a bit. And so there won't be a nuclear war because Ukraine doesn't have nukes, and there's absolutely no way that Russia would use nukes against Ukraine. They want Ukraine to fold into and become part of Russia. And this is why an invasion of Ukraine actually would really play against all Putin's wishes. because it would turn the Ukrainians more and more against, and it already is, just his forces outside Ukraine. And an unwilling Ukraine, I mean, Russia saw that in Afghanistan, for instance, that you can hold a country and you can be in charge of all the big things in the country, all the weapons and all the transport and everything, but you're still not got really in control. And imagine the Russia trying to keep control of an unwilling Ukraine. Then it'd be much weaker than it is now. It wouldn't be stronger, because we have so many dissidents in Ukraine that we'd have to try and suppress. It's just not going to work. So this idea that Russia really wants to invade Ukraine, and I've got a bit about this at the end here. So I looked at this article. I'll just go down to it. Where is it? Where have I put it? Oh yes, here we are. The messy Pliny thing. The first Pliny is always a mess. So it's really not. It doesn't make sense that this is this is really a planned invasion, because Russia, if they wanted, Russia's done it before. If they want to invade, they would not tell everyone what they're doing. They wouldn't mass a big army outside Ukraine that goes up and down and fires shells in the air and makes sure everyone knows they're there, very obvious from satellites, and then just they spend weeks there just doing nothing but very obvious, and just waiting while NATO sends. First of all, if they'd wanted to invade, they'd invaded back last year, in spring last year, when nobody was really expecting it, and when NATO hadn't really paid much attention to Ukraine for a fair while. And that was their moment. If they really wanted to invade Ukraine, not a very sensible thing to do, but if that was their objective, then a military objective, that's what they'd have done. Invaded last spring, when nobody was expecting it. Instead, they go up to the borders of Ukraine last spring, and they just stand around there for ages and make sure that NATO is very, very obvious that they're there, and NATO has all started talking about it, and the media all talking about it. Then they go away again, then they come back again, and they spend all winter. They're spending all winter just outside the borders of Ukraine, just encamped there, making sure that NATO sends lots and lots of weapons to Ukraine, and making sure that Ukrainians have plenty of time to learn how to fire these new weapons, and making sure that NATO has plenty of time to send lots and lots of troops along the borders of neighbouring NATO countries, all ready to go there, and then give NATO plenty of time to have loads and loads of discussions to work out exactly what sanctions they're going to impose on Russia if it invades, and then gradually add to them more and more. The most recent is that they've decided if Russia invades, they're going to confiscate all of Putin's finances outside of Russia. And then they've also decided they're not going to sell, they're going to stop the sale of high-tech electronic equipment to Russia. So, and then they're going to stop all Russian banks from trading in US dollars, which is a very big difficulty. So they've given them loads and loads of time to work out all these ways they're going to sanction Russia, and given Ukraine lots and lots of time to get its weapons in place, and NATO lots and lots of time to get its soldiers all prepared and ready to go to the nearby NATO countries at any moment if they're needed. And then their military commander who has masterminded all this and has sort of set up this scenario and says, right, this is what we've been waiting for all year. Now we're ready. Now is just the time to invade Ukraine. Now how does that make sense as a military strategy? I mean, just think about it. And they're not amateurs. And then the other thing that the first Pliny is always a mess. And so this was a very long, Russia's possible invasion of Ukraine, and he's an expert who goes into great detail as to what they would have to do. This would be the very first time that Russia has used such a large invasion army, if it did invade. And it would be very difficult. People don't realize how slow an invasion is. They would travel about 20 miles a day. if that's the very fastest possible invasion, it would likely be much slower than that. Now, there are lots of problems that they would encounter as they tried to invade Ukraine. So first of all, from this article, the Russian army is very dependent on railways. Their logistics is done via the railways. And so the army would have to march into Ukraine along a railway line, unless it went along the sea route. But if it's, assuming it is not involved in strengthening the Crimea, but doing the most obvious thing, which is to invade the Donbass region, then it's dependent on railway lines. And because it hasn't got any sea nearby to use for logistics. And then there's a particular city, I've got the name here somewhere, see if I can find it. Yes, one city, so it's very, very difficult for a big invasion army to take over a city of 1 million or 2 million people with lots and lots of insurgents inside that's going to fire back from their buildings. We've seen this scenario play out many times in places like Iraq and so on, that the people firing from inside cities, and it takes ages and ages and ages for a big army to finally subdue an entire city. So Russia would not do that. They wouldn't try and take over a city. They would go around it, but there's one city that they can't avoid. They've got 1.5 million people, so it's a big city, and it's called Kharkiv, if I pronounce that properly, Kharkiv anyway. And it's a major junction of roads and railroads, and if they don't take that, then it'll be very difficult for them to invade Ukraine, because the defenders can make things much harder by destroying the bridges. But then if Russia does take this city, then it would take them quite a while to eventually capture it, and the defendants would be able to destroy all the bridges and railroads, at least if they were being sensible. They could also flood a nearby river, and then Russia would also at some point need to take Kiev because of its symbolic value. And this would not happen quickly. So we talk about a long, long war. So the claim is that they're going to start in February. Well, the ground at the moment, it's winter, so it will be night fighting, a lot of it. So it has got disadvantages this time of year, but the ground is very, very cold and frosty, so that's the advantage. But if they haven't finished their invasion by March, and it seems incredibly unlikely they do finish an invasion if they start in February and they finish it by March, because remember, 20 miles a day is very, very optimistic, very fast movement. And then they've got to take Kharkiv or some other city. So they've got to take this city, or they face huge problems from not taking it. And then hopefully eventually they want to take Kiev, and both of those are major, major, major undertakings. And so this idea, and then all the time that this war is grinding forward day after day after day, and all the time Russian soldiers are dying, and the defendants will be shooting back and firing back with tank busters and missiles and things, all these fancy new weapons they got from NATO, and they'd be firing them back and killing Russian soldiers. And then the Russian soldiers in the modern warfare, then there'd be videos and photographs being sent back to their families in Russia, and this would soon the families would be they wouldn't have a very strong appetite for this war. And then when it comes to March, then you have the notorious spring thaw, and it basically turns into a quagmire of marshes and peat bogs and mud. And a modern army could keep going, but of course much slower, but most likely they just stop at that point. And meanwhile, all the time, NATO is supplying more and more weapons to Ukraine. So the weapons they've given so far are just the initial shipment of weapons to keep Russia out. But if a big invasion started on the way, then there'd be masses of weapons flowing into Ukraine to help them fight back from NATO. NATO would not send combat troops to Ukraine, but they would be flying over with their planes and their spy planes and keeping tabs on exactly, and they'd have their satellite images, and they'd tell Ukraine exactly what Russia is doing, and keeping tabs on the Russian communications. And Russia has never done an operation like this. Indeed, nobody has. Not in modern warfare conditions in Western Europe, with very high tech on both sides like this. And so an invasion of Ukraine, it would be Russia's largest combined arms operation since the Battle of Berlin in 1945, long, long ago. And as the Russians saying, the first blinny is always a mess. If you're making pancakes, then the first pancake you make is always a mess, apparently. And so this is what would be like with Russia, but the first invasion, things would be bound to go wrong. They've never done anything like this before. There'd be all sorts of hiccups and flaws and things not working quite right. And there's no way Putin wants this, and it's not his approach. And then now, if you go back to this agreement that I talked about up here, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. So Russia promised not to attack the Ukraine. So you might ask, but what about Crimea? I mean, surely they attacked Crimea. Well, no, they didn't. There was enough of an excuse with Crimea. Take me a little while to find it. But there was enough of an excuse with Crimea that, see if I can find it up here. Yeah, that's all about how they could have invaded Ukraine. I think it's a bit down here. I've got so I'll come to that in a minute. Wait a bit. Where's the Crimea section? Oh yes, here we are. Yes, because all three agreed to refrain from the threat of use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Now, with Crimea, Russia didn't use an invasion army. They destabilized, well, that's what the West say anyway, they destabilized the Crimean region, and there were lots of Russian sympathizers went over the border from mercenaries, but without the Russian insignia, and it's very hard to pin it down to being Russia's instigation, although that's what the West say. And so Russia had this kind of deniability about it all. And then finally, when things got really quite tough and quite a lot of unrest in Crimea, Russia went in as a kind of unilateral peacekeeper, as it were. And then they said that so Russia's, one of their main excuses was the provisions of the Budapest Memorandum do not apply to circumstances resulting from the action of domestic, political or socio-economic factors. So basically they're saying that the Crimeans didn't want to stay in Ukraine, and Russia is not committed by the Budapest Memorandum to keep the Crimeans in Ukraine if they want to leave and join Budapest, join Russia. So that was Russia's excuse. And then there was a whole lot of other so Westerners call it blatant violation of the memorandum, but there's enough grey area, and Russia has lots of legal excuses or reasons that it gives there, and there's enough of that, so you get Russian sympathizers, and they think that Russia's a very strong case in Crimea. So I'm not going to try and say who's right and who's wrong in all this, but from the point of view of the Russian sympathizers in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, then Crimea was something that they are able to approve. They say that what Russia did is okay. So there are two sides to that. But if Russia did a blatant invasion of Ukraine with 120,000 troops, then that would be a very blatant violation of the Budapest Agreement. And there's absolutely, many people who were sympathetic about Crimea just couldn't go along with that. And they would just be pushed over to NATO. And this is not me saying it, this is the Carnegie Foundation analysis of Ukraine that I'm very roughly summarising there. I've got that in one of my other articles and I link through to it. So there's, and there we are, I'll go to all this summarising what, and that's the article there, and this is my summary of it. None of this is me. I'm not an expert on this, I'm just summarising what they say. So basically, so I've answered all. So let's see what else I've gone into all that. And no way he wants a nuclear war. Right. So Putin is shrewd. He's not a stupid man. And so none of this makes sense if Russia really does want to invade Ukraine. It just would make no sense at all. And I just talk very briefly about the internet. So some people claim, but Russian, I'll come to that in a minute. Yes, it fits in here quite right. So none of this makes sense if Putin wants concessions from, if Putin wants to invade Ukraine. But all of it does make sense if Putin wants concessions from NATO. And obviously, NATO wanted the basically two things that Russia wanted. One is some kind of concession on military things that NATO would agree not to do exercises close to Ukraine and not to station nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and close to the Russian border, and not to station nuclear weapons or intermediate missiles in Ukraine. And Russia went a bit further. They wanted the US to remove all its nuclear weapons from Europe. But there's no way they're going to do that. But this is quite normal. This is how negotiation goes. That it's like that both sides put in requests far more than they expect the other side to concede. So Russia and the United States both done that. And then they haggle away, and they both try and get as much as possible from the other side, and concede as little as possible from their side. So all this time, Russia keeps saying, we just do not accept anything short of completely forbidding Ukraine to join NATO. Now, NATO can't do that. NATO have this open door policy. It's built into the treaty itself. That the decision that any European country can apply to join NATO, and that the decision as to whether they are accepted is by a unanimous decision amongst all NATO states. And there's no possibility for adding in there, but Russia can veto it. If Russia doesn't want them to join, then they can't join. That's just not in there. Russia is not a member of NATO, so it doesn't have a say in whether Ukraine joins NATO. And so then United States could, in theory, promise to Russia and say, yes, but we are always going to say that we don't accept Ukraine as a member. But that would be against the spirit of the NATO agreement. So they couldn't really do that either. And anyway, we've all seen how, like with the Iran deal, that one president makes a promise, the next president reverses it. Then Biden can only say for himself. He can't promise even, if he's a two-term president, he could promise through to 2028, otherwise through to 2024. But he could only, based on what he knows so far, he could only promise through to 2024. So in theory, Putin could say, well, from now until 2024, I will not accept, the United States will not accept Ukraine as a member of NATO, but that would be against the spirit of NATO too. It's an open door policy. He couldn't do that, not really. So Russia knows this. So this is just like when you're having like a bargaining, and two people are bargaining. One say, well, I'll give you $10. You say, I'll give you $20. And the other one says, no, but I can throw in two cakes instead of one. But will you buy two cakes for your price instead of one? And then you can get it at 2/3 each or something. And it's basically that kind of a haggling that's going on here, where and NATO is sort of promising, is asking for demanding more, and then the background to all that is that both sides saying, so yes. So now I'll go down to this one. So Russia is currently looking at NATO's proposals, and NATO, as expected, Russia, as expected, asked NATO, said to NATO that they just can't accept what they said about Ukraine, letting Ukraine join NATO. The United States, and the United States, exactly as expected, just said back to NATO, said back to Russia, well, we can't change that. So that's just like an argument where you have an argument that maybe you've had with a friend, and it always goes the same way, and you always say the same things. They're just playing the same thing again. But they have many things they can agree on, and including the agreements on arms control and they already have had many agreements with Russia in the past. It has to be balanced, reciprocal, and verifiable. And they've sent a very clear signal about the readiness of their force and about the sanctions as well. Biden talked about the sanctions, so I'll just talk about that internet thing. So when NATO, Biden has said to Russia, if you invade Ukraine, then we will do all these big sanctions. Then some people say, but if you go and sanction Russia, then Russian submarines will cut the internet between the island and America and slow down all the internet traffic from NATO. But if that happened, then that would, well, for one thing, that would cripple Russian businesses as well, because they use the internet too, and it would just slow down the internet, and the breaks would be repaired in about 3 days for each break. And this would lead America to be very, very strong and firm in their policy towards Russia. That's not, and Russia haven't even threatened to do that. That's just people with just the NBC Nightly News or something said that, and it's just the media, and the media just making hay while the sun shines, sort of making lots of clickbait stories out of all this, and also the politicians. It's not just Putin that deflects away from his problems at home. After 2 years with COVID, then most countries have had, many countries, especially the ones hardest hit by COVID, have run into problems, and they just want to, especially with the Omicron wave as well, on top of everything. And the leaders, it's not, they're do I want to talk about that? Don't want to talk about that too much, because it's not just to say that the deflecting away from your own problems is not just something in NATO that Putin wants. Is kind of motivation for Putin. So people talk about that a lot for Putin. They say, Putin wants all these concessions for Europe, but he also wants to deflect away from his problems at home. Well, you can say the same for Biden. You could say the same for United Kingdom, for Boris Johnson. They've all got problems at home too. So I don't think that's unique to Putin. I think they all have problems at home that they wouldn't really mind deflecting away from. And then there's another reason, and so I think they tendency, just because everyone, all nerves, all the things that have happened in the past, in the last year, and the things with Boris Johnson, he may have to resign quite soon, although it's possible he survives the situation that he's in. But so then, in that situation, it is a way of deflecting away from your problems at home to say, well, look, we are at risk of and then they'll pick it up and they claim that there's a risk of a world war or a nuclear war. And they won't actually go out and say as such, but kind of indirectly hint at it in a kind of vague, ominous way. And then you see there isn't any risk of a world war or a nuclear war. It's an invasion of Ukraine. It's not an invasion of NATO. And so, but by doing that, then because eventually they're going to come to some kind of agreement at the end of all this, or just some kind of a ceasefire. Well, there isn't any war anyway, so there isn't a ceasefire. But there could be a ceasefire in the Donbass region in Ukraine, where there's always some kind of low-level combat going on, or there's some low-level conflict or whatever. But even just sort of shooting things in the air or whatever, I don't know. But there are incidents in the Donbass region from time to time. I think just several times a year. I'm not very well up on all this, but there isn't a war going on between Russia and Ukraine. These soldiers aren't fighting Ukraine. They're just standing around by the border while doing exercises and things, and doing joint exercises with Belarus. They aren't attacking Ukraine, so there isn't anything to have a ceasefire with. But maybe at some point Russia may just go away. You may just say, well, we're not going to get any concessions. But I think that's unlikely. I think at some point there will be some concessions, because there's a lot in that NATO proposal that's a benefit to Russia. And Russia particularly Russia has done a voluntary moratorium on intermediate range nuclear weapons, and it wants to go back to something like the INF Treaty, and the US also want to go back to that. But they need to save face. They need to do it in the right kind of way. And that's an awful lot of what this is about. Just some way of going back into the INF Treaty. But they have to do it in such a way that they both seem to be tough negotiators. And so this then, I go on to this. This is like, this was William Ellis's idea. And he says, I'll just read it out. Russia's whole negotiating strategy at the moment is based around their threat to invade. They need to seem like a real threat for anyone to take them seriously. If they say, we're planning to invade Ukraine, but then keep all their troops at home and do absolutely nothing to suggest they're getting ready for a war, do you think anyone would pay them any attention? So if you think about that, if Russia was to say, well, we just go home, we want to negotiate, we'll send our army home, and let's just go and talk about things, but there's no need for this army, then would NATO go on talking to them? And so they have to conduct exercises and send troops to the front, as does Ukraine, NATO and the US. So again, if NATO just said, oh, well, they're not going to invade Ukraine, and they just don't do anything, then that would be about the only reason why Russia would invade Ukraine. It would just do a token invasion to get NATO's attention. So as does the Ukraine, NATO and US. It's all part of negotiations. If Russia's only goal was to invade Ukraine, it would have done it right at the start by surprise and dealt with consequences later. They've done that sort of thing before, and so I talked about that. But obviously that isn't their intent here. They want other assurances and concessions that are far more important to them. That's why they're still talking. So they wouldn't still be talking if they wanted to invade Ukraine, because the more they talk, the more NATO gets ready. So by far the likeliest outcome, exactly what happens in 99% of these things. Many of us here are old enough to have seen this same story play out many times in different parts of the world. There will be a big show of strength on both sides, lots of threats and haggling, and a settlement of some sort will be reached, and everyone will go home. It's like when two stags fight a lot of noise and fury signifying nothing, just redefining the boundaries. In the rare event it does come to war, it could only be a small localized affair. Russia has nothing to gain from a bigger conflict, and neither does anyone else. And that's absolutely true. So it's like when two stags fight. This is from William Ellis's what he said. It's like when two stags fight, a lot of noise and fury signifying nothing, just redefining the boundaries. And a lot of this is to do with the INF Treaty and the various movements. It's not just Russia and NATO has done. NATO did a very big military exercise a year or so ago, involving the whole of Europe, and people don't talk about it much. And then there was the big one in the Baltic, last year I think it was, and so Russia does its exercises, and Russia has sent this big army to the border of Ukraine, and it's doing a big exercise with Belarus, but they're not the only one who does exercises. NATO do too, and so that's it's all part of something that goes on for a long time, but always exercises. We always have incidents between Russian ships and US ships in the sea and so on, and they're just to do with redefining the boundaries between two countries, or redefining, not shifting the boundaries, but the boundaries of what's acceptable. Like again, at the end of this agreement, then they may come to some agreement not to put their troops near the border. So that's defining a boundary, to keep the troops apart. And then one thing NATO said is that they would have much more transparency about the movements of their troops and about their plans. So they would tell Russia, and Russia would tell NATO exactly what they're going to do. And they say, we're going to do this and this and this, instead of just going ahead and doing them in a surprise, and let them know in advance, and warn them, saying, we're going to do this. So that would be another boundary thing. And then an agreement not to stage nukes, and with independent verification of it, not to stage nukes. Yeah, they surely would be if they had something like that. So all these, and so this is two impalas fighting. And when one thing about how stags fight, look at how they lock their antlers to each other. Then the antlers are very dangerous, and a deer stag could kill another stag very easily, just by sticking the spike into the side of its body. But they don't do that. They have a kind of ritual where they lock their antlers to each other, and they push and pull at it. And a stag doesn't try to kill another stag, even though they're rivals for the same herd of female deer, which is usually what the fighting is about. Then a deer will never try to kill another deer. So very rarely they'll do it by accident. And if one deer accidentally harms another deer, then it might well die. But it's not intentional. And this situation is very similar. That if Russia and NATO are locking their antlers with each other, they're doing a kind of, it's a ritualized combat. It's a ritualized show of strength. So Russia is moving its troops around, and NATO is moving its troops around, and they're having talks, and they're firing shells in the air, and they're very much like stags locking antlers with each other. And then at the end result of all this is that the two stags then they might be claiming territories, and then with the territory one where all the hinds will have and the stags have a season. So there's one season when the stags and the female deer. So unlike humans, then females are only receptive to the male deers in a particular season of the year, and the rest of the year they aren't. and the male and females just run around together, and then they just form big herds, and then they kind of separate out, and when it comes to the season, and then each stag will create a particular territory, and gather a small, and the more powerful stags will gather a herd of female deer, and that they kind of protect and look after, and that's what the fighting is about. So I mean, it's obviously a different situation, but there are seasons to it as well, for the for human beings. So this is the kind of like the stag fighting season, where Russia and NATO are locking antlers, and so we'll lock antlers for a while and define the territories, and then it'll be over. And we have this end date of March, where there's no way that Russia could invade. Well, it could, but there's no way practically it really is going to after the spring thaw. So that's the end date for negotiations, and both sides know that too. So we have another month of this, and it's going to be very stop and start, probably. And then they'll come to a point where they'll say, well, we can't. So you know that when people are making bargains, then very often they walk away from the bargain. So someone will say, well, I'll give you 2 cakes, but you have to pay 2/3 of the price for each one. Another one say, I can't go down 2/3 of the price, I can do 3/4 of the price. Another one says, no way. And the one saying 3/4 of the price says, right, well, then that's us done, you walk away. And then a bit later, then the other one will say, come back, there's another possibility here. So we can expect that sort of a thing to happen here as well. So it is very like it that there will be times when this thing seems to be completely clogged, and they're not going to agree, and there's no room for manoeuvre, and then they'll say, there's nothing we can do, and then they'll start manoeuvring around with their troops and things, and then they'll say, but then the one or other will give a little bit and say, well, actually we can do this, and then so to concede again, and this again is how these things happen. So the only difference this time with previous times is that the mainstream media are playing this up like anything, and many times every day they find a new story to run on this, and every day they're saying, and it's very much like with the false prophets that say every day that Jesus is going to return the next day, because that keeps their followers listening to them. And then when he doesn't return, then they say, no, he's going to return tomorrow. And then, no, it's not tomorrow, I made a mistake in my calculation, it's going to be the day after. And in that way, they get people, they get their followers to listen to them for weeks and months and years. But it's very like that, the false prophets of Jesus returning. It's very like that with this invasion thing, that the journalists have learned that if they say that Russia's going to invade, and they get lots of people clicking on the titles of their articles and sharing them with their friends, and their paper gets more publicity and gets better known and gets shared a lot, especially if it's a minor paper, then says something very dramatic, then suddenly everybody knows about this paper, this online paper, and that's basically what's going on. So there's and we got Zelensky, the president for Ukraine, is asking the mainstream media to stop doing this. He says this panic doesn't achieve anything, and this is damaging the Ukrainian economy, because all this panic is causing people to not deal with Ukraine and to leave Ukraine. And so that's another thing that's going on. So again, so that is independent, and that's kind of spiraling out of control, independently of the governments. So the governments see some value in some of this mainstream media, but to a certain extent the journalists are powering this now, and so the governments are starting to backpedal a bit, because they're saying, well, no, that's not what's going on. He isn't going to invade Ukraine. So you start seeing that a bit, because they're trying to control the media, because a certain amount of the mainstream media is good for for them, because it's saying, look, this is serious. NATO is serious and Russia is serious. But when it gets too much, then it's actually damaging Ukraine, and it's making things difficult for NATO and for Russia. So we get that as well. So all that is going on now, and so expect them to backpedal from time to time, and then to kind of stoke the media fury up a bit, and then backpedal again, and expect to continue to get stories from the mainstream media every day, and expect this to continue for another month. So probably this will continue through to the end of February and into March. And it's possible we get an agreement before then, but it's also possible we don't. And maybe it'll only go as far as February, because people might reason, well, an invasion of Ukraine would take at least several weeks, so by the time we got the middle of February it's not going to happen. I don't know. But everyone seems to have a reason to prolong it, because it deflects away from what's happening to them at home, and because if they prolong it, then maybe they'll get more concessions from the other party. So for both those reasons, then and there's no particular reason to stop it, because there isn't any end date until March, which is quite a long way away, and probably by March then the Omicron waves will be over, and things will be a little bit easier, and Boris Johnson will have finished will have dealt with, will either resigned or got through it, and because the UK contributes quite a bit to the stories about all this, even though they're not really a major part, and they're one of the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum. And then United States, perhaps in the United States, Biden will confirm the first black woman Supreme Court justice, which will help with his ratings, and he likely get something approved for Build Back Better. And both that will put less pressure on, less reason for him to deflect attention away, and so those are all reasons as well. And maybe Putin will, I don't know very much about what's happening in Russia, maybe Putin will get things going a bit easier in Russia as well. And then we'll have much better vaccines coming along, and those are coming along, they're just entering phase 3, so I expect it to be another few, a month or two before those start get approved. Maybe April, I don't know what time it will be. Late the first or second quarter of this year, we may get more new vaccines that are much better than Pfizer, and maybe the third quarter, I don't know, it depends, all depends on phase 3, and that's very variable. And things will get much easier as we get towards the end, as we get later on this year, and people have less need to deflect away. But in terms of this is an end date of sometime February, March. Until then, expect them to be making a big fuss about it for every day of the week, every week of the month, and just hopefully this helps you to see that there's nothing here to be scared of. There's no risk of a world war, there's no risk of nuclear war, and it's highly unlikely that there will be an invasion, and it's extremely unlikely even that there's a small conflict involving combat troops of Russia and Ukraine, and there's no possibility of combat troops of NATO being involved. And so hopefully that helps, and so I'll stop this and I'll upload this, and hopefully this helps some of you be a bit less scared.